I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Robert Epstein. He's a psychologist, longtime researcher, professor, a distinguished scientist who is passionate about educating the public about advances in mental health and the behavioral sciences. The former editor-in-chief of Psychology Today, Dr. Epstein is currently a senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. He's also the author of the book Teen 2.0, which we're going to be talking about today. Dr. Epstein, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
It's my pleasure, Adam.
So this book, Teen 2.0, was written about 15 years ago. A lot has changed in the last 15 years, most notably social media. But I'm hoping we can talk about some of the universals of this period of life, adolescence, and then move over to what's new.
Sure, of course. Yes, there have been a lot of changes, and mainly of a technological nature, which in many respects have made the problems that I spoke about in the book, have made them even worse.
So what are some of these universals about the teenage period of life that we can cover before getting into how technology might shift what's going on?
Well, the dilemma here is that what we consider to be universals regarding the teen years are actually not. They're not universal historically. They're not universal in cultures around the world, even to this day. So what we would say are universal characteristics of the teen years here are things like turmoil, so that almost 50% of our teens under 18 are diagnosable under DSM guidelines with at least one behavioral, emotional, or cognitive disorder. That signifies a lot of turmoil, and again, at least one disorder. There's also conflict with authority figures, conflict with parents. We equate adolescence with turmoil. There's depression, extreme depression is very common. Suicide, the third leading cause of death among our teens. I could go on and on. I mean, in fact, a lot of my book is about the horrific characteristics of many teens, not all, but many teens in our culture, and just how difficult those years are. That's reflected in our media portrayals of teens. And in fact, when we surveyed parents, we found that parents predicted that the score that teens would get on my online adultness test, which is at howadultareyou.com, adults predicted that teens would score only 48% on this test of adultness, which measures adult competencies that typify adulthood in our country. So our picture of teens is very, very negative. And in fact, teens do have significant problems in our culture. To some extent, this has spread to other cultures, especially in Europe. And I can explain, I think, fairly accurately now why these problems exist. But to get back to my original point, these are not universal characteristics, not at all. There are still roughly 100 cultures around the world where there is no teen turmoil, no conflict with parents, no teen depression, no teen suicide. To make this a little personal, my sister has lived in various countries in Africa, off and on for a long time. And she herself said she never saw anything like the American teen in those countries where she lived in Africa. So what we think is universal is not universal. There are many countries still to this day which don't even have a word for adolescence. When I was working with a Japanese translator on a visit to Japan, he told me, well, technically in Japanese, there is a word. he said, but it's a highly technical term that no one uses.
Mhm.
So the question is, what is really universal, and why is all this turmoil so universal in our own country? And those are the questions that I attempt to address in this book, which was originally called The Case Against Adolescence when it first came out. And then in an updated version, uh, we changed the title to Teen 2.0, Saving Our Children and Families from the Torment of Adolescence.
So to frame this in terms of nature and nurture, it seems clear that a large effect, if not the majority, is due to these social and environmental changes, and that might be particularly exacerbated in weird societies, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which doesn't characterize most of the world. But then on the nature side, you also have like puberty going on during adolescence and hormonal changes that have been shown to impact behavior and mental health. So I think that's what I was curious about when I was getting at universals of this phase of life.
Well, again, this is very curious. A lot of the turmoil that we see, we blame on hormonal changes associated with puberty, or thanks to our pharmaceutical industry, we blame on the so-called defective teen brain. But as soon as you realize that the turmoil is not universal, again, just go back in our own history and you will see that. The various phases of life that are discussed in various writings, discussed by Shakespeare, for example, do not include adolescence. There was no such phase of life. But as soon as you realize that that's true, then you're kind of you have a quandary because you say, well, wait a minute, what about this puberty? What about the hormones? What about the defective teen brain and so on? And the bottom line there is that these connections are correlational only. I had a long dinner with a distinguished brain researcher from the National Institutes of Health at one point, a long, long dinner in which we discussed this correlation versus causation issue. And he admitted straight out that these connections that people make between characteristics of the teen brain or hormonal changes occurring during the teen years and the problems that we see, the behavioral and emotional problems that we see, are just correlations. In other words, no one has ever shown, and in fact, I don't think anyone can show, that there's a causal relationship between the hormonal changes of puberty or characteristics of the teen brain and the teen turmoil that we see. No one has ever shown a connection. Uh, so, and that given that the turmoil is not universal, that tells us that indirectly, at least, it tells us that the hormonal changes are not necessarily harmful. They do not necessarily give rise to teen angst, to teen depression. It tells us that the characteristics of the teen brain are just what they are, and that they too are not responsible for the turmoil that we see. And yet, major media sources, including Scientific American, by the way, where I once published an article called The Myth of the Teen Brain, which is still current today, by the way. Even Scientific American featured a defective teen brain on one of its covers. Obviously not in the same issue where they published my article, The Myth of the Teen Brain. But the point is that through media, through television, the internet, through movies, over and over and over again, there are literally thousands of examples out there. We see this myth, we see this correlation turned over and over again into a causal relationship. Now, as I'm sure you know, given your own impressive educational background, one of the very, very first things that we teach when we're teaching elementary courses on statistics, which I've taught, or courses on psychology, for that matter, courses on research methods, one of the very first things that we teach is the phrase correlation
It's
does
not
not
causation.
imply causation. That's right. And when I teach that sentence, I add a word. I say correlation does not even imply causation, just to make it even the point even stronger. But so, in other words, where you see an association, where you see two things happening at the same time, uh, that doesn't tell you anything about a causal link. Nothing. And as you said just a couple of minutes ago, uh, there is ample evidence, and that's really what my book is about. There is ample evidence uh, that the problems that we see in our culture among our teens are caused by our culture. They are not caused by hormonal changes. They are not caused by characteristics of the teen brain. There is no evidence whatsoever that there's a causal relationship here involving biology. The cause is our culture. Now, again, you can go around the world to different cultures and find no teen turmoil. The other kind of evidence, by the way, that you can bring to bear on this issue, the nature-nurture issue, is anthropological evidence. Anthropologists, and there are a couple of them who actually wrote a book on this topic, anthropologists have noted that in various kinds of societies, such as uh, the Inuit Indians, for example, who are in the North American continent, up where it's very, very cold, that the Inuit Indians had no adolescence at all until Western influences began to affect their culture, until we brought in Western media, until we brought in the Western educational system. There was no sign of a teen turmoil. Not only that, the Inuit, before Western culture arrived, had no police force. They had no need for police force. Within 10 years of influence by Western culture, they not only had various sorts of crime emerging, but they had a very, very serious problem emerging with teens. And they had to create a police force to deal with the teen problems, which included not only crime, but drug use. And again, teen suicide, which I mentioned earlier. They had to create a police force to deal with the many problems that were arising among their teens. So the anthropological evidence shows in different parts of the world that adolescence emerges typically within 10 years or so when Western cultural aspects begin to take hold of a culture. There is simply no doubt whatsoever, at least in my own mind, after having researched this issue for a very long time, that the teen turmoil that we see, in fact, the whole period of life we call adolescence, is caused by culture, not by biological factors. It's caused by culture. Well,
And
there's
is the
yeah.
argument here specifically the case against adolescence being a unique biological cause of these problems, whether internalizing or externalizing symptoms? Or is it a maybe broader case against the idea of adolescence and that it would make more sense historically to consider people either children or adults and maybe little to no in between period?
Well, I would say the latter. In other words, the case against adolescence that I make has to do with straightening out this nature nurture problem, of course. But again, it's about how this period of life that we created it does a lot of damage. It does damage to the individuals, the young people themselves, because many are so depressed, so angry, turn to drugs, but also it's about solutions. In other words, it's about how we could make changes in society that would eliminate this horrific period of life. Uh, Interesting footnote, since you are presumably getting your education in a building called William James Hall, and you're surrounded by all kinds of historically significant content in the history of psychology, because William James was the man who really who first brought modern research psychology into being in the United States.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
that another historical figure in psychology, G. Stanley Hall, who was at Johns Hopkins, not at Harvard, but G. Stanley Hall is really the man who invented the kind of adolescence now that
mhm, mhm.
we think is real, and in fact is not.
I've seen a
And I
1904 paper by him cited. The only thing I remember is the idea of storm and stress. I haven't read the paper itself.
Well, it's not a paper. It's a very, very lengthy book. I have a first edition of it downstairs in my library. And it's a very, very impressive work of scholarship. I mean, it's about 1,000 pages long, and it's called Adolescence, and then has a very, very, very long subtitle. Uh, and I have this gorgeous first edition of this remarkable book, which is entirely wrong. So what's going on here? Well, uh, Hall lived in Baltimore, which is where Johns Hopkins University is, and at that time, especially in the first decade of the 1900s, Baltimore was like other major cities, like New York and Boston. Baltimore was growing at an alarming rate. Uh, Nationwide, literally millions of people were immigrating to the United States, and hundreds of thousands of these people couldn't be placed anywhere, and they were on the streets. And a lot of the people who were on the streets were young people. So authorities were overwhelmed. I mean, I think the population of New York grew by something like a factor of 10 over a period of 10 or 15 years. I mean, these were serious growth problems, and they had to be dealt with. The the teens on the street, young people, I should say, on the street problem, that's really what inspired Hall to imagine that these teen years are a separate phase of life. He was also captivated by what turned out to be a false and erroneous theory at the time, which can be stated: ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So
What does
you've
that mean?
probably heard that. That means that the way we grow as individuals, so that's ontogeny, mirrors, recapitulates, in that lovely phrase, recapitulates phylogeny. Phylogeny is the way we evolve. Phylogeny is how we've changed biologically over time. So uh, phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Hall believed in this theory that was current at the time, but was discredited a couple of decades later. In fact, the German book that introduced this idea, was found to quite fraudulently to be misusing data, misusing images, uh, and was completely banished from biological sciences. But in psychology and related fields in the social sciences, we never got the message. We never got the message. So Hall actually based his concept of adolescence on this faulty theory from biology, and basically thought that the teen years was a period of life that recapitulated a time in our evolutionary history when we were savages.
Hmm. That's
So,
interesting. So I don't know if that's just a if that's genuinely the interpretation, then I would agree with you that that doesn't make much sense. But I think I've heard of it in the sense of like our development is a reflection of the demands of our evolutionary past. So, for example, once puberty kicks in, then things related to reproduction kick in. So, I've heard one evolutionary explanation, for example, that um, females are higher in depression and anxiety, but that effect doesn't seem to kick in until post puberty. And one explanation for that from an evolutionary perspective might be that pre puberty, there's not a terrible amount of difference in the behavioral demands of males and females, but that post puberty, females are more anxious because males get bigger and stronger. Females have, historically at least, have to devote more of their time and resources to child rearing, perhaps, and that could lead to increases in depression or anxiety.
of course, but that's a completely different type of argument.
Mm-hmm.
What that says is that in the past, uh, our ancestors who developed in a certain way had a better chance of surviving.
Mm-hmm.
That's a completely different argument than the one that Hall was making, again, based on a faulty theory from biology. So Hall, for example, referred to uh, biological the biological belief, the popular belief at the time, that if you look at images of the developing embryo, the human embryo, that at one point we look like little tadpoles, you see, and then at some point we look like little reptiles, and at some point we begin to look like little mammals, and so on. So
Mm-hmm.
this is a completely different idea. This was saying that the way we grow recapitulates evolution itself. That's a very, very different idea. And that turned out to be wrong. And some of the images that were being used to support this theory at the time were, in fact, used fraudulently. And that's why, among other reasons, that's why eventually this theory was completely thrown out of the biological sciences. But as I say, we never got the message.
So, from
And
a neurodevelopmental perspective, that seems somewhat true because the most fundamental areas, like our brainstem, mature earliest, and then you get like early sensory regions and senses, basic senses like vision would have evolved before we got things like emotions, and then you get limbic regions, and then only do your like
sure.
most evolutionarily recent prefrontal cortex regions mature latest, like in adolescence or in your late 20s even.
Of course, but that's not the same as saying that that as we grow, after birth, as we grow throughout our lives, we're somehow recapitulating the way all species evolved. It's a completely different kind of claim, and there is no credible evidence to support that claim, but that's what G. Stanley Hall based his entire theory of adolescence on. Now, again, you have to put yourself in his shoes. He's looking outside his window from his office, and he literally sees turmoil in the streets, and most of it is caused by young people
Mm-hmm.
who have no jobs and have nothing to do. And to him, it appeared that this was an inevitable stage of life. Now, he admits that in this massive book, that he's not really looking at teens in other cultures, other countries. And later on, as scholarship, modern Western scholarship evolved in some countries in Africa and Asia, uh, his ideas were rejected vehemently by scholars in other countries, because again, in other countries they didn't see this. What Hall was seeing was an effect of massive immigration. And that really led to faulty thinking on his part. Plus, of course, there was this popular theory at the time, too, that he was using. And he just put two and two together, you could say, but he wasn't looking at the large picture. He wasn't looking at history, where teen turmoil is, for the most part, completely absent. Uh, he was not looking at cultures around the world. So if you add history and anthropology, especially comparative anthropology, to the mix, you find that Hall was simply mistaken. The problem is that this belief in adolescence is almost like the flat earth belief. As you know, there are still many people around the world, possibly most people around the world, who believe that the earth is flat. Why? Well, because if you just look around you, the earth looks flat. In other words, the flat earth belief is consistent with everyday experience in many respects. So the way this works out, the way this plays out, is it's just almost diabolical, because Hall's looking out the window, sees teen turmoil. As a result of the turmoil, three systems are put into place. And again, I trace the history of this in my book. People can learn about the book at teen20.com, teen20.com. But he's looking out the window, sees teen turmoil. Three systems are put into place. These systems end up guaranteeing that there will be teen turmoil forevermore. They instantiate it. They make it real. So what are they? Well, first of all, throughout history and still in many cultures around the world, during the teen years, teens learn how to become adults. Their learning is at its peak. The ability to learn is at its peak during the teen years, which is why, as we get older and older, the only song lyrics we can remember and the only tunes we can remember are the ones we learned when we were teens. So, ask me any Beatles song and I can sing it for you. But I can't do that, with contemporary music. It doesn't stick. So during the teen years, wow, knowledge sticks. So teens had always worked side by side with adults, because the teen years, that's what they're for. You reach puberty, you're now capable of bearing children, and you need quickly to learn how to become an adult. How do you do that? You work side by side with adults. But the first set of laws that was put in place to deal with our immigration chaos forbade young people from working for the first time in history, anywhere in the world, by the way. In fact, the first teen labor laws in the United States were laws that required young people to work.
Uh-huh.
So that was the Pilgrims. They had laws that required young people to work. But beginning in the early 1900s, we began to pass laws that forbade young people from working.
And was that forbidding working full time or working at all?
Working at all.
And was the
Now, these
motivation,
laws,
did that coincide with education becoming mandatory?
that's the second area. But let me say a little bit more about the labor first. So these so-called child labor laws, now they were being put in place in part because many young people were being exploited. There were no labor protections. It was during the same period that there were literally thousands of strikes across the United States, the growing United States, to try to unionize workers, to try to stop all workers from being exploited. And since there were no age limits, a lot of young people, even young children, were working in mines under dangerous conditions. So the child labor laws were put in place to stop the exploitation of child labor, but also to get young people off the streets. See, there were multiple problems here. being tackled. Now, these laws did not fare well in the courts because they were interfering with parental rights. So over and over again, these laws went to various courts and were thrown out. Multiple times they went to the US Supreme Court and were thrown out. They didn't really start to stick until the 1940s, but the form of the child labor laws that finally made it through the courts in the 1940s is still with us today. And okay, so that's number one. Now, when you stop young people from working, and by the way, even to this day, if a young person does work, they don't have to be paid the minimum wage. So there's still so many restrictions on labor by young people, again, that have stuck now since the 1940s. But when you do this, you are severing a very important relationship, that connection between young people, especially in their teens, and adults. When I was giving a lecture on this issue in Scotland, a man in the audience raised his hand and said, I can't do a Scottish accent. I wish I could. I love the Scottish accent. But this man said, well, you know, we have a program in Scotland and it has an extremely high success rate. And we take young people in the high schools who are getting into trouble, and part-time, sometimes even full-time, we connect them with people in the trades, and they work side by side with electricians and plumbers and so on and other tradespeople. He said, and the problems disappear. Their problems disappear, he said, completely, more than 90% of the time. I think their success rate at the time might even have been 98%. He said, because now they're doing something useful, they're getting some money, which of course they love to have, and they're working side by side with not just any adults, not criminal adults, not drug dealers. They're working side by side with highly responsible, hardworking adults. And I said, well, that's marvelous. And I actually eventually got his address and sent him my book. And you know, that's the kind of thing now that the child labor laws, that's a connection that they broke. There is change number one. Change number two, you already surmised, is the mandatory education laws.
Right. So
Now,
it
the
sounds
first,
like what's necessary there, what's isn't work per se, but something like apprenticeship or education, but maybe education in a broader sense than merely academic.
exactly. So the apprenticeship system, which still exists in many cultures around the world, had existed throughout history, throughout human history, and the apprenticeship system was destroyed by these laws, which were passed first in the United States and then spread to some other countries, mainly in Europe. But you know, again, it was an invention. These were invented by us mainly because of industrialization, mainly because of massive immigration. Education. Let's talk about mandatory education laws. The first mandatory education law in the United States was passed, I believe, in Massachusetts in 1852. I could be off by a year or two, but that law was a law based on competence. It was a competency-based law. What does that mean? That means that in Massachusetts, young people up to the age of 14 were required to do some schooling, to go do some school, if they could not read, write, and do basic arithmetic. In other words, it was competency based. It said you have to go to school if you don't know how to do certain things, you don't have certain knowledge. Now, people were being trained, of course, mainly by their parents. Among the wealthy, they were being trained by tutors. So there were lots of young people who already had these abilities, had these skills, had the knowledge, were not required to go to school. It took a very, very long time, more than 50 years, before mandatory education laws spread throughout the country. When did that happen? Well, by 1918 or so, mandatory education was now mandatory in all the states. So what's so special about 1918, and why did it take so long for these laws to pass? Well, first of all, number one, they're again interfering with parental rights, with the say that parents have about how to raise children. But there was this need to get young people off the street. Mandatory education laws helped tremendously in just sweeping young people off the street. But 1918 is also important because of World War I. So 1918, that was a time when we were at war, and we noticed that certain areas of Germany, who was our main enemy in World War I, had mandatory education laws. So not all of Germany, but certain parts of Germany had mandatory education laws. We thought, this is almost like what happened with the Russians and Sputnik. We thought, oh, they're ahead of us in some way, and we also thought, well, with those kinds of laws, we could we could take care of all those young people on the street. To some extent, we were emulating a system in Germany. Now, if you look at the original discussions about mandatory education laws, you'll also find that we were trying to replicate what was happening in the new factories.
Right.
And by the way, I'm not making this up. This was actually in the discussions of the day. We thought that we could set up education factories. We could emulate what was happening on on these assembly lines to mass produce, for example, the new cars. Like the Ford Model T was one of the early ones, and of course Ford's. Some people misremember him as the inventor of the car. He most certainly was not. What he invented was the assembly line. So the mandatory education laws put into place this assembly line, factory inspired, Germany inspired system of mass education, which was something new and was in some ways a great success. And then it got a lot of young people off the street, got a lot of young people to learn some things, but it was based on all kinds of faulty notions. The most frustrating of which I think you'll relate to, is that there was this notion at the time that we could instill in young people all the knowledge they will ever need throughout their lives during the early years. And that idea is still inherent in the kind of educational system that exists today. We have mandatory education laws, and we cram in every bit of knowledge which we think a young person is going to need, and they'll never need any other knowledge. And in fact, in the United States, only about 30% of the adult population, hard for you to imagine since you're probably on or near Harvard's campus right now, but only about 30% of the adult population in the United States has a 4-year college degree. The vast majority of Americans don't have any college degree, or at most a trade level degree or a 2-year degree. The 4-year college degree is still uncommon in the United States, because there's still this notion, which came from the early 1900s, which has stuck with us, that you can cram in all the knowledge anyone will need during those young years, during the teen years in particular. And then after that, no more education is necessary. And of course, we have these odd role models like Bill Gates, who dropped out of Harvard because who needs that? You don't need that education. We have, the founders of Google who dropped out of Stanford graduate school. We have Steve Jobs, a dropout, and so on. So there is still this notion that you can cram in all the education in the early years, and then that's all. And in fact, what people said at the time was that we can give young people this education, then send them off into business and industry, and they'll be fine. Now, we were also, in emulating what was happening in the factories, we were trying to train young people like rats in a Skinner box. My doctorate, by the way, was with B.F. Skinner. And I had an office in William James Hall, and I was Skinner's last doctoral student. But the point is that we also were trying to train all of our young people to be responsive to bells,
Right,
and
right.
alarms and rigid schedules. We wanted to regiment them to be prepared to work in business and industry, especially in the factories. And and that's why schools to this day are highly regimented. And again, of course, in elementary school, people walk in lines and they respond to bells, and they, eat in a certain spot, and so on and so forth. Highly, highly regimented. Well, these practices that still exist, they come from the factory model, and
Mhm,
they were
mhm,
put into place in the early 1900s. So here we are, 1918 now. School is mandatory across the United States, but that wasn't enough,
mhm,
because what
mhm,
happened over time was that we raised the age for mandatory education. So it started at 14, went to 16. In most states, it's now 18. And believe it or not, uh, the uh, the Secretary of Education under Barack Obama wanted to raise the mandatory schooling age to, I believe, 21 or 22.
mhm. So most
Now,
people who criticize our education system, they don't seem to believe that mandatory education is a bad thing. They seem to be criticizing the fact that we do have this factory line, very sort of regimented system that isn't great for true individualized education.
correct, right. And Skinner was a strong advocate for personalizing, individualizing education. That's was one of his motivations for inventing one of the first successful teaching machines. uh, Individualized education, which now can occur with computers and can occur online, is highly individualized. And the most successful kind of education that anyone ever invented was the tutorial, the tutor system, where it's one-on-one teaching. And to some extent, that's what programmed learning or digital learning is all about. But that never really stuck. It never really caught on. There was a lot of excitement about it, when one program or another was introduced, the personalized education, but it never really caught on. To this day, it still has not, and to this day, we're stuck pretty much with the old factory system. One of the reasons why we can't get rid of it is because education was unionized very successfully. It's one of the areas where unions caught hold. And the education union is one of the most powerful unions in the United States, and one of the biggest lobbying groups that we have, not state by state and also nationwide. And it's again in the interest of the education union to keep things going the way they are. It's in the in because that creates job stability, and it's in the interest of the education union to increase the minimum age at which schooling is required. So that's the second system. And then the third system is really heinous, in my opinion. It's
Well,
what's
before we get
usually,
there, one more
yeah,
comment on this
sure.
idea of cramming people full of knowledge while they're young. I do have
Yes.
some sympathy for that because not that once you finish this mandatory schooling, learning ends. Obviously, learning is a lifelong process, but thinking about things like orbital dynamics, the basic physics of our solar system, I don't imagine even pursuing a higher education that I ever would have learned that if not for it being part of this sort of mandatory curriculum.
Well, I could not disagree with you more. Not only does education, learning need to occur throughout our lives, but more and more, since there's so much more out there to learn, and since the world is changing at a faster and faster rate, more and more education simply needs to be spread across the lifespan, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
There's no telling now whether what knowledge you are going to need, or certainly your children are going to need 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, maybe even 5 years from now. It's not so clear. I mean, give a simple example. My youngest, I have five children, and my youngest is 17, and she's now being trained to drive a car. And thank God, because then we won't have to cart her around quite so much, or she won't be carted around so much by her friends, not all of whom are highly responsible people. So the fact is, though, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there'll be no need to teach 16 or 17-year-olds how to drive. At some point, vehicles will be self-driving, and that kind of education will be outmoded. So I think that we should be looking at education afresh. I'm positive, and that this is true now, and it'll be even more true in the future, that education simply needs to be spread out over a lifetime and needs to be responsive to what knowledge is useful, what knowledge people want to have. I think people should be motivated to learn. I've taught, well, now I just do research, but I taught for more than 40 years, and I've taught pretty much at every level of education. And I can tell you there's a night and day difference between having students who are highly motivated to learn, who want to be there, who know why they're there, and those who are being forced. It's night and day. I mean, those people are just suffering. The ones who are being forced to sit there, having no interest whatsoever in being there, they're not. It's a waste of time and resources. Education needs to be individualized, personalized, and spread out over a lifetime, and it should be responsive to the changing needs of society and individual inclination. So on that point, you and I think, differ slightly. Now, let me get to the third area.
There is one more thing there.
Oh,
So
no.
in the case of science education, let's imagine there was no science education. You're
Sure.
completely right that there would be a minority of students who are enthralled by it and are going to be great students, self-motivated, and they'll learn everything they need to learn. Do you
Right.
think there would be a risk that for everyone else who doesn't self-select into learning about science, that pseudoscience or things like that would be even more pervasive than they already are if you didn't have this baseline mandatory foundational knowledge?
Well, again, I could talk for an hour just on that issue. So, and I do want to get to my third area, but let me be brief here in replying. First of all, very few people actually ever end up going into science. So that core would still go into science. And if anything, that core would be larger because you'd have more people who are more enthusiastic and who learned more younger because of their motivation, and they were not being slowed down, which is what really happens. Those people, the core, are not being slowed down by this education system, which is trying to teach us everything.
Mm-hmm.
So now, regarding the other point you raised, which was about the pseudoscience and the belief in pseudoscience, which we're now facing, so I mean, it's ugly. We're now facing in a way I've never seen in my whole lifetime, where this total lack of any understanding of science and its value. The fact is, not only will that also always exist, just like belief in the flat earth, but technology, the internet, is making that kind of ignorance spread faster and farther. And nothing is going to stop that trend either.
We'll get there.
Now, can I move on to my third area?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so we're now back in the early 1900s again, and a third system was put in place. The third system was it's a misnomer. It's called the juvenile justice system. So in my book, I call it the juvenile injustice system.
Mm-hmm.
This was the third major system of laws and regulations that was put into place to get young people off the streets. Okay, how did this work? Well, first of all, new laws were put in place that turned activity that had never been considered criminal ever. It turned perfectly non-criminal activity into criminal activity, because as soon as you make a law that says something is illegal, now it's criminal by definition. Like playing ball on the street, singing on the street, gathering on the street with friends and cavorting. All kinds of laws were put in place that criminalized the behavior of young people on the streets. And they were now arrested and put into these new facilities that were called juvenile justice facilities, and they have various kinds of names to this day. They still exist by the tens of thousands across the country. And all of the constitutional rights that young people had always enjoyed since such rights were codified in the United States were now taken away from young people. This is why I call it the juvenile injustice system. So now, if you were under a certain age, you did not have the right to face your accuser. You did not have the right to a trial by jury. You did not have the right to an attorney. Literally, very basic constitutional rights, which protect us from mistreatment, manipulation by government systems, were taken away from young people. So you could do something mischievous, end up in a facility, and be kept there until you were 21. You might be 14. You could be kept in a facility without any way to get out. By the way, even your parents did not need to be consulted. So I have case after case after case, which I describe in the book, in which I show just how horrendous this system has been and can be at times. I also talk about a fairly recent case in which a juvenile court judge was being bribed by a company that runs these facilities for young people, and to the tune of millions of dollars in bribes over a period of years for just sending people en masse from his juvenile court into these facilities, where generally speaking, again, you have no rights. Now, this issue did not make it to the Supreme Court until the 1960s in a very famous case, in which the Supreme Court said, well, hey, young people do have constitutional rights. How did we forget that? How did we forget that? In other words, if you were in the 1800s, if you were 11 or 12 and you committed a murder, you could be hanged. Crime was crime, and age was not considered a protection. But at least that 11-year-old who committed the murder had a right to face his or her or their accuser, and had a right to counsel and so on, and had a right to trial by jury. So all of those rights were taken away. Now, footnote here. All three of these systems were put in place to some extent because of one woman, Jane Addams, who was one of the first female Nobel laureates. She founded a facility in Chicago in the 1800s called the Addams House. And she believes very strongly in women's rights, and women from around the country, many of them very wealthy, came for various activities at her facility, or in some cases spent years there helping her to change the world for the better. And these people were extremely good. Some of them, because they were major donors to politicians, they had extremely good connections in Washington, D.C., especially in the State House in Illinois. And all three of these systems came to be, were put into effect to some extent because of Jane Addams and her associates. Now, I mention this in part because the juvenile justice system was envisioned by Jane Addams and her colleagues to be a system. This was what they had in mind when they worked very hard to get the juvenile justice system created. It was based on the family model. The idea was, oh, these young people, most of them male, these young people, these young men are getting into trouble because they don't have a good, solid, stable family life. So we're going to set up facilities that acts as a substitute family, and it's going to be run by women, and they're going to be very nurturing, and that's going to heal these young people who are getting into trouble. And that was the concept. So did that actually happen? Well, it's, the first few facilities were actually following that model, but what everyone learned rather quickly was that these young people, these young men, most of them young men who might be 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, imagine that. And these are the ones making trouble. They were tough. These are young adults who were very tough people who had committed criminal acts of one sort or another. And they couldn't be handled by nurturing women. So almost overnight, these facilities turned into very harsh environments. Now, also because this wasn't the mainstream criminal justice system, these facilities had very limited resources. So often, to keep these young men in place, they were handcuffed or chained to a bed, a door, a radiator. And the men running these facilities were men who were tough men, some of them extremely sadistic. And that is true to this day. When one of Jane Addams' associates went and visited, this is after the system had been in place for a couple of decades, and when she went and visited some of these facilities, she was horrified. Mm-hmm. Because it's just not what they had in mind. But if you're going to incarcerate tough young people, well, you've got to have even tougher old people running the facilities. So this is an issue too that has been examined by the courts over time, and a number of them have been shut down, and regulations have been put in place here and there. But generally speaking, these facilities still don't have the resources of the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. So all three systems were put in place, I would say, with good intentions. But when you look at what happened over time, all three systems became, in some cases, for many individuals, absurd, absolutely absurd. So, where do these tough young people belong is the question. Well, right. In some cases, they belong in the criminal justice system, but there are alternatives too. So again, late 1800s, early 1900s, this is small scale stuff, but you find that Boys Town was set up, and other programs like Boys Town, you may have heard of it. It was set up by an Irish priest. And this was a place where young people could go, often because they're sent there by the court as an alternative to incarceration. And the belief of this, the founder of Boys Town, was that what really makes people behave well is not nurturing moms, but responsibility. And so Boys Town and other programs like Boys Town were run by the young people themselves. They were the police, they were the mayor, they were helping to build the buildings. In fact, there were very few so-called adults at these places, and these had an extremely high success rate in the sense that the recidivism was very, very low. And giving people really authority over their lives and giving them responsibility was extremely, extremely a powerful way. This is like that program in Scotland I just mentioned, but it was a powerful way of getting people onto the right track. Unfortunately, these programs have not flourished. They still exist. There's still a few here and there, even in Southern California, where I am now, but they never went mainstream. And in many of these facilities, including the original Boys Town, turned into mental health treatment facilities where there are lots of adults and there's lots of mind-numbing medications used to keep people under control. So the original concept has been largely lost, but again, as far as anyone can tell who's looked back at these facilities in the early days, they proved the point that I'm making over and over again in this book, which is, if you let young people into adult society, as you recognize that they're capable of being responsible adults, and you give them responsibility and authority, then adolescence disappears. This stage of life that we invented from nothing, it disappears. They turn into, for the most part, almost all turn into responsible young adults. This is not my work, but there are other researchers who have found that the most troublesome young people, the most troublesome teens, in many cases, turn out to be natural leaders. In many cases, they turn out to be highly successful adults. The reason why they're making trouble is because they resent the fact that they're being treated like children, and they keep telling people, I'm not a child. They want to do adult things, but they get in trouble for doing adult things. Adults take drugs. Adults drink alcohol. They drink a lot of alcohol. These young troublemakers they know they're adults and they're trying to do adult things, and they're just not allowed, and they end up being punished for doing adult things.
And what do you make of the fact that to become a leader or master, you have to go through an apprenticeship phase? And it sounds like you were making the argument that adolescence is a relatively new Western concept, but even the root word, the Latin word adolescens is, well, it refers both to adolescence and more or less in the way it's currently defined, but there's also another definition which is more like apprentice. So the two seem to go hand in hand.
I'm a strong believer in the apprentice system. I'm a strong believer in homeschooling. I'm a strong believer in looking at people of any age, one by one, as individuals. And if you do that, what you're going to find is that a lot of young people should not be trapped into the inane media and entertainment industry controlled world of adolescence. They don't want to be trapped there. They want to start businesses. And in fact, I got interested in this topic because I noticed that my younger son, when he was about 15 or 16, was extremely mature compared to my older son. You see, they're all different. We recognize that among so-called adults that they're all different, but for some reason we think that everyone under a certain age, let's say under 21 or under 18, depending on the laws at the time, we believe they're all equally incompetent and immature. Well, that's not true. The individual differences are just as dramatic among young people as they are among older people. So, you have to go case by case. And I began to wonder why my 15-year-old, who was trading baseball cards, very successfully and making money doing so, and he was desperate to want to start a business, and he could have started a business easily. I have no doubt it would have been very successful. But why was he not allowed to? And for that matter, why was I allowed to search his room? He had no privacy rights. Why was I supposed to be controlling him? The real turning point for me came when I found out that he and his buddies had been stealing my pickup truck over and over again, even though none of them had licenses. And I brought my son into the police department when I found out, and this police officer, he had been up all night trying to find a missing 5-year-old. He was a complete wreck. He was in a terrible mood. And he just lit into my wonderful son, Justin. He just was brutal in telling my son about all the damage he could have done and how many people could have been killed and so on and so forth. And we walked out of there, and I found my attitude changed, because I realized, number one, that even though he had taken the truck over and over again, that he had never gotten a ticket. He had never gotten into an accident. In other words, he could drive. He
Right.
could drive. Why was he not allowed to drive? See, this is the competency-based issue. Why was he not allowed to drive when he was obviously perfectly capable of driving? And as we walked out of there, my son, who always had a weak stomach, got nauseated and had stomach pains and so on. And I felt so bad, because I realized, wait a minute, there's something wrong with the system, not with what my son has done. There's something wrong with the system. Now, deception, that's forced on young people, because when parents become controllers rather than facilitators, facilitating young people to become adults, facilitating their entry into adulthood, their entry into the adult world, when instead we become controllers, holding them back, pushing them back, saying you're still a child, you're still a child, you're still a child, when past the point where that's just ludicrous, we do them harm, and we harm our relationships, and we force our sons and daughters, I'm not going to call them children, because past puberty they're not. What we force our sons and daughters, we force our offspring to lead secret lives.
Mhm.
Now, it was my experience with my first two offspring that led me into this kind of research, first looking at other people's research and eventually conducting my own research with young people, which we might have time to talk about, but possibly not. But with my other offspring that I had later, because I have five sons and daughters, 3 sons, 2 daughters, I completely changed my parenting. Completely changed my parenting. And I ended up being a facilitator, not a controller. And from the time that my kids were very young, I was saying things to them such as, you decide, sweetie, you decide. What should I order? You decide. At school, I can either do this or do that. I would say, you decide. I've been invited to a party. There's some pretty rough people there, and I would say, you decide. And then I would say, and whatever you decide, whether things go great or things go wrong, I will be there for you. I will back you up. No matter what happens, I will back you up. As a result, that separation that normally occurs when parents are controlling, the secretiveness that normally occurs when parents are controlling, absolutely gone. So and I eventually apologized to my 2 eldest. I dedicated my book to my children. I wrote about my second son, the mature one, in the introduction. I wrote about the eldest one in the book itself. Basically, with my younger ones, I became a facilitator, and they loved it. And they still love it. I'm carrying in my pocket a coin, which I always carry with me, which I'll probably, let's see if I can get it, because it's so pretty. But it was given to me by one of my daughters, and it's caught. And it says, I love you to the moon and back. And I found on my desk a couple of days ago a Post-it note from one of my daughters, I love you to the moon and back. And they never have kept any secrets from me, ever. They have from their mom, but they have not kept secrets from me, because they know I don't judge them. They know that. I give them my opinion. I absolutely do. I tell them about the risks that I see, but then I say, you decide. Should I smoke marijuana? I say, you decide. But, there are some risks. Here's my opinion. I've never smoked marijuana myself, but you decide. And it's just led to a completely different kind of relationship, a wonderful relationship, a positive relationship, and no turmoil, none,
Positive
zero.
benefits from treating adolescents as independent adults rather than adults in training.
Well,
Positive benefits,
independent and individual, each very different from the other.
right?
Uh, and recognizing that they have that potential to behave as adults, but you have to recognize that, and you have to nurture that. And we could do that as a society, but we're not doing it, and we're heading in the wrong direction. And this whole discussion started with your concerns about the internet and social media. And this is where, unfortunately, technology is letting us down. Uh, a friend of mine, one of the most brilliant people I've ever known, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was on uh, the scientific advisory board of the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology, which is where I do my research. He passed away, unfortunately, about 2 years ago. But he studied teens at one point, and he developed a point of view about teens very similar to my own. And he noted in one of his studies that teens in the United States, this was a couple decades ago, were spending 65 hours a week with peers. Well,
Mhm.
sure, they're cut off from adults. They're herded like cattle into schools where they're forced to interact with peers who are the last people on earth that they should be forced to associate with, because they have nothing to teach them, nothing that has to do with adulthood anyway. That they're controlled by specialized divisions of the media industry and the entertainment industry, the fashion industry. And Csikszentmihalyi found 65 hours a week with peers in the United States. In developing nations around the world, it's more like 5 hours a week. Who are they associating with? They're associating with the people they're going to become. They're associating with older people, with responsible adults. So anyway,
So
I'm not sorry.
some classic ideas in developmental psychology, what you just said, that over time children begin to spend more time with peers than with their family, and peers become the primary agents of socialization. Now that seems to be by self-choice. It doesn't seem to be that we're herding them in with peers and they have no choice and they'd rather be interacting with adults. If you ask a teen, they probably don't want to be interacting with adults.
That's not what I found. Again, you know about confirmation bias, and of course, you find what you're looking for. But that's not what I have found. I found there are many young people. I don't care whether it's a minority. It doesn't matter what the number is. There are lots of young people who don't want to be stuck
Mhm.
in the world of teen culture. They want to do adult things. They get in trouble, unfortunately, for doing adult things. They want to be treated with respect. They want to be treated uh, as adults.
Uh-huh.
Now,
What it
uh,
seems like children love most, this is related to the this idea of the zone of proximal development, is interacting with someone slightly more advanced than you. So if you're a teenager, perhaps you prefer to be learning from an older teenager rather than an adult with a much wider age gap. What do you think about that?
that's just in this culture, and that's just because that's how young people, including yourself, have been trained to think. And that's not true in other cultures around the world. It was not true through most of human history, and it's wrong. It's simply a wrong idea. Young people on a case by case basis, we need to give them the opportunity. In fact, this can be done through testing. If they can show that they have the competence, they have the maturity level to get certain rights, the right to own property, the right to start a business, and so on, the right to privacy, then they should be allowed to do that. And many will take advantage of that. If there are 20 million teens in this country, which there tend to be, any particular time, maybe 2 million of them will want to do that. Let me quickly get to my data because we're running out of time here, but I would just quickly get to a study that I currently have under review. It has more than 100,000 participants in it. These are people who've taken my online test of adultness, which is at howadultareyou.com. And we looked at data from a large number of people who've taken this online questionnaire. And it measures 14 different competencies which typify adulthood in the United States. I developed these with a doctoral student of mine, and she consulted with various developmental experts. So we have these 14 areas of competence. We ask adults what percentage score they predict the teens, 13 to 17, will score on this test. They predict 48%. So that's how we think of teens. Adults over 18 score on average about 91%. And young people ages 13 to 17 score about 89.5%. And in a couple of those 14 competency areas, they outscore adults generally speaking. But more importantly, and looking at this from a individual differences perspective, more importantly, about 30% of young people ages 13 to 17, 30% outscore the median adult.
Mhm.
I'm going to say that again. 30% of young people, teens, outscore the median adult. So they're outscoring half of adults over age 18. And we have people who are from ages 18 up to 70 something.
And how old are the
And
teens?
the teens are ages 13 to 17.
Uh-huh.
And 30% of them outscore the median adult. Now, these statistics here are really interesting. Because if you just look at the median score by age, then it looks at first, I'm sorry, mean. If you just look at the mean score at each age, then it looks like the curve is going up, okay, starting at age 13. It looks like it's going up gradually and then kind of levels off. Those are means. But statistics, as Mark Twain said, they're right. Three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. Statistics can be so misleading. And in this case, the means are misleading because instead of looking at the means, if you just show a scatter plot of the scores, what you find is there's a tremendous range of scores when people are young. Tremendous range of scores. So there's lots of points scattered all over the place in those years between 13 and 17. The scatter becomes smaller as people get older, but at all ages, there are a lot of people who are right at the top. There are a lot of people who score very highly. So what's really happening here? What's happening is it's not that we are getting continuously more mature and more competent. It's what's happening is there are a lot of us who are, when we're very young, are mature and competent, but we just don't recognize that in our society. And we basically throw all those people away and we treat them all as if they're as immature and as incompetent as those people down at the bottom of the graph.
Uh-huh.
And so what's happening over time? What's happening over time is that the mean is going up because those people at the bottom are disappearing gradually from the distribution. Why? Because they're either being incarcerated, they're ending up in a juvenile justice facility, they're ending up in mental health facilities, or they're ending up dead. They're just gradually disappearing from the distribution, which makes the means go up.
So I agree with the data completely. That makes sense, but I would disagree with the interpretation. So an analogy here would be height. So by definition, 50% of adults are going to be above average height. Now, if you told me that 30% of 13 to 17-year-olds were taller than the average adult, that would make sense because some are going to grow up to be very tall. But I wouldn't look at that and say that this means that the mean height isn't increasing with age. The mean height is still increasing with age. So that.
Which is meaningless when you're deciding what to do with this particular person. That's the problem, is these statistics
Mhm.
do not apply to individuals. And this particular young person who's right in front of you right now, could be the next Mozart, the next Einstein. We're not letting him or her or them, we're not letting them to flourish. We're often we're these young people are being held back by the educational system. One of the people who endorsed my book most enthusiastically was John Taylor Gattos, who was multiple times New York City Teacher of the Year, several times New York State Teacher of the Year. He finally quit in a huff. He quit because he said we've been artificially extending childhood to older and older years. We are mistreating millions of young people. We are trying to educate them in a factory environment. We're not looking at individual differences. We're holding millions of young people back. We're treating them with tremendous disrespect that they don't deserve. That's New York State Teacher of the Year. So, what you're talking about is you're talking about statistics. They don't apply to individuals. What do we do with that person who's in front of us now? What do I do with this child who's very mature and very competent? Why does this young person have to be held back? Why can't this person start a business? Why can't this person own property and so on? Why can't this person choose to spread his, her, or their education over a lifetime? Why does that person's education have to be crammed in? And why does that person have to go to school at a time when he, she, or they don't want to be crammed in? They don't want to be in school having all that information
Right.
crammed in. So we're talking about here a respect for individual differences.
Mhm.
We're talking here about recognizing that not all young people are equally incompetent or immature. We're recognizing here that an age boundary is fundamentally absurd. That people certainly do not suddenly become mature and competent overnight on when they turn 18 or 21 or whatever cutoff is being used. That's absurd that they don't.
Mhm.
And they're not all equally incompetent and immature under that arbitrary age, which is changed from time to time. And by the way, in the United States, which differs from state to state.
Right.
So this is one of those situations, and you'll probably run into it yourself, Adam, and good luck to you is all I can say. This is one of those situations in which I've debated developmental psychologists on these issues, and I've won those debates hands down, which I know without any doubt that I am right based on a 10-year detailed examination of relevant anthropological data, neurological data, and so on. I know without doubt that G. Stanley Hall was wrong. I understand why he wrote what he wrote. I know that the people at the Adams House had good intentions, but all three of those systems make no sense anymore, but we're stuck with them. In other words, I know that I'm correct. I am correct in what I'm saying, but you know what? I'm facing systems, entrenched systems, which, if anything, are getting stronger. And now we're faced with another stage of life named after a friend of mine who's also on the scientific advisory board of AIBRT. We now have another stage of life, which has been added on to adolescence. And it's called young adulthood, and
Right.
it's, ages 18 to 25 and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. And indeed, yes, we have millions of young people now, partly because of COVID, partly because of the labor situation, all kinds of reasons, who now live with their parents
Mhm.
well past age 18. That's a growing trend. And so now we're actually artificially extending childhood to even older and older years. All of these systems that I've mentioned, the specialized divisions of the entertainment and fashion industries and so on, all of them are growing, getting stronger, exerting more control over young people in our country. And here is really the worst uh, indicator of this trend. As of now, it's close to 10 years ago, there were more psychoactive drugs being prescribed for young people than all other prescription drugs combined, and that includes acne medication and antibiotics.
Mhm.
Why
Mhm.
these psychoactive drugs? Because somehow or other, the pharmaceutical companies have convinced, well, with the help of some psychologists, by the way, have convinced the American public that teens have faulty brains, and all the distress we see and the anger and so on, the frustration, it's all due to a faulty brain, and that you need these psychoactive medications to try to fix the faulty brain.
Now, are
And
these
that's where
arbitrary
we are.
cutoffs
That's,
of
sorry.
age? Are these arbitrary cutoffs of age any different from the somewhat arbitrary cutoffs of psychiatric diagnoses? Because on one hand, you can say like someone who's just above the cutoff for clinical depression isn't that different from someone just below the cutoff, so you shouldn't treat them as different groups of people. And you could say the same thing of someone who's at a younger age but more mature for their age versus someone who's older but less mature. But it's the categories are still functionally useful, so no one's saying they're perfect.
That's a topic for another discussion, but I will tell you this, that the big part of the problem with teens in our country has to do with the fact that the mental health industries, and don't kid yourself, these are industries. I know, I'm in the field. Uh, that the mental health industry has bought into this adolescence idea, and that's why they use some of these same age cutoffs. And that is why the terminology suddenly changes when someone reaches a certain age. So, someone who's adversarial when their young person gets one label, and then if they're still adversarial past a certain age, then they get a much more creepy and damaging label, which really can haunt them the rest of their lives. And the point is that the mental health industry is part of the problem. It benefits from this system of labeling, and it gets a huge volume of customers from families in which there are teens and there's a lot of teen turmoil. It gets a lot of its customers among these young people themselves who are experiencing this turmoil. So, the mental health industries, they're part of the problem. So, of course, again, these specialized divisions of the fashion and entertainment industries and so on. So I actually do have a chapter called Enemies of the Teen, and I explain what these entities are, these businesses, these industries, how they benefited. In some case, I explain the history of how these industries help to create this time of life, which is, in my opinion, unnecessary and extremely harmful. But again, I'm a realistic person. I understand the forces that have developed these industries, that have developed these faulty concepts like that of the teen brain.
Mhm.
I understand where they've come from. I understand why, uh, you know, why John Taylor Gatto couldn't stop them, and others. I'm not the only one who's conveyed these ideas, and why Csikszentmihalyi couldn't stop them, and so on. Margaret Mead, for that matter, she said very early on. I mean, her work has been disputed in some ways, but still, she did say very early on that she saw young people, in other cultures where there was no adolescence, no sign of teen turmoil at all. The lone voices out there that have made these points, we've had no effect. We've had no effect. My book, The Case Against Adolescence, was cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, but it's had no effect. It's not widely cited, and I've just come to accept that there are forces, all kinds of forces. I mean, today especially with what we've been through in the past 2 years, we see these forces. We see the forces of nationalism around the world, which are putting the entire planet in danger. We see violence. We saw an attempt to take over the government. Very recently, we're seeing all kinds of horrible forces in motion in various societies around the world. The forces that created adolescence, they're getting stronger. And I actually even say that at the end of the book, and the internet has made things much, much worse. If I have not done this study, but if we repeated the kind of study that Csikszentmihalyi published a number of years ago, in which he said young people are in touch with peers and contact with peers 65 hours a week, by now, because of the internet, that number is certainly much higher. It could even be 100 hours a week. When one of my daughters was about 13, I went into her bedroom at night just to, we do that as parents just to check on her. And, there she was sleeping soundly, which was so nice. But around her pillow were 5 electronic devices. 5.
Mm-hmm.
We're out of touch with the kind of lives that young people live now. Their lives are deeply immersed in technology. They're deeply immersed in social media, deeply immersed in the internet. And those are forces that are having larger and larger impacts on their lives. And those forces trap them even more securely in the world of teen culture and isolate them from responsible adults and bring them even more under the control of the fashion and entertainment industries, and to some extent the media industries in general.
So there
So
is
that's
a lot
where
of
we are.
research that shows that
Yes.
social media has negative consequences on mental health. But it does seem like in the case of adolescence, it's also an opportunity or an outlet perhaps for more independence or interactions with adults, because the internet is, anyone can interact with anyone. So do you think there are some positive effects of it as well?
I don't think they outweigh the negative effects.
Maybe from an individual differences standpoint, some people might do better in those environments.
Well, if we would allow young people to have certain rights, perhaps because they pass competency tests. If we're nervous, we don't let them drive vehicles unless they can pass a competency test. If we would allow young people to use the internet and give them certain rights as they're using the internet, the right, for example, to start a business, the right to own property, which is pretty basic, so that what's theirs is really theirs, then I think, yes, they would be using technology in ways that are perhaps highly constructive. But with the moment they don't have those rights, and what they care about the most are their peers and the way their peers view them. And that's what leads to now more mental health problems and more teen suicide, and so on. So here's the thing. I also study tech, and I study the influence of tech on people's thinking and behavior, and that's my main research area these days. I testified before Congress in 2019 about some of my research in this area. I was a few months ago on Joe Rogan's podcast, the largest podcast in the world, apparently, and Rogan was very, very shocked and moved by the data I was describing. We're publishing studies in some of the top journals in the world, and what we're finding is that the internet has made possible new forms of influence that have never existed before in human history. They're extremely powerful. Some of the effects we found are among the most powerful effects ever discovered in the behavioral sciences. So take all that I just said and connect that up with teens becoming more and more, internet connected during more hours of each and every day, and project that into the future a bit. I think the problems that we've seen are going to get worse, and I don't think we're going to give young people those rights, which used on the internet could really be a good thing for young people, but I don't think we're going to give them those rights. If anything, I think we're going to abridge the few rights they actually still have. So I I do my work. I collect my data. I do my best to analyze it in a reasonable way. I put it out there for the world to see and for colleagues to judge. And then I keep going. I just keep going, and I'm going to keep doing that as long as I can. Just like my friend Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I'm going to, and the world will do what it does when it comes to teens. The nature nurture question, unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry and other industries, they've weighed in on this. And you know how they've weighed in, because I've read a little bit about your work. You know how they've weighed in. They've weighed in incorrectly, very, very firmly, and completely on the side of on the side of nurture. I'm sorry, on the side of nature, on the biological side, on the teen brain side. And they set aside the impact of culture and society, the impact of nurture. And that's how things have gone. And I think that's a trend that has been continuing now for about a century. Technology is making everything move faster, including that kind of trend. And I think that's where we're headed. I think all of the crazy kinds of things that the internet has made happen in recent years, I think they're going to get crazier. There's no way that you can somehow flag material that's going to convince people that this material is valid and that material isn't. There's just no way you're going to do that so that people believe it. So the crazy stuff online seems as real to people as material that's serious. I mean, I have about, including translations, I have more than 50 online psychological tests. But there are websites, even a dating site, that have tens of thousands of psychological tests on them that are just posted by anyone. My tests are scientifically validated. We go through a multi-year process with each and every test to try to assess its reliability and validity as best we can. But for every test that we post, there are probably 10,000 tests posted by just anybody, and no one can tell the difference between what's real and what's fake, what's true and what's false. Nothing is going to stop that trend, in my opinion. Nothing.
Well, maybe there's a more optimistic take on it, but we could discuss that a future time, perhaps. We've covered a lot of ground, so thank you very much for your time, Dr. Epstein.
My pleasure, Adam. And by the way, thank you for challenging me. Not everyone does, and you did, and I admire you for it. And, as I have told my kids, whatever you decide, whatever you do, I will back you up. And I respect the fact that you challenged me. I respect that tremendously. And I wish you well in your professional and personal future, both. And, you're in the same program that I was in many, many years ago. There's a lot of history all around you. And there's a lot of truth to be found there too. Do your best, find the truth and act on it as best you can. Meanwhile, the world is just going to do whatever it does.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as we discussed, lifelong learning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam.